All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for taking time to attend our meeting today for the City of Helena's Multimodal Traffic Study. My name is Sarah Nicolai, and I will be the moderator for today's meeting. I work for Robert Petch and Associates here in Helena, and we're the consulting firm that was hired by the city to help develop this study. Joining me today from RPA are Scott Randall and Carrie Peterson, who will be helping with the presentation and answering your questions. And just looking at our participant list, I think we have a couple of folks representing the city. So we have Dave Konopke joining, and I believe Mark Young also will be joining from the city and be available to answer questions as well. So for our presentation today, I will just touch briefly on the study area that we considered, and we'll also provide a summary of some of the key points that we heard during earlier public and stakeholder outreach. We'll spend most of the meeting focused on the study recommendations. At the end of the meeting, I'll outline additional public involvement opportunities and the next steps for finalizing the study. And we'll just ask everyone to please hold your questions until the end of the presentation. And as you're thinking of questions, please type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to enter those questions at any time. You're also welcome to use the thumbs up feature to indicate if you have interest in questions that are submitted by others. And this will just help us prioritize based on the level of interest. We've reserved about an hour at the end of the presentation to address your questions. If for some reason you're unable or uncomfortable to ask questions during the presentation, we'll also provide our contact information if you'd like to talk with us directly. One other item I wanted to note is that we are recording today's presentation, and we'll provide a video available on the study website following this meeting in case you'd like to refer back or if you'd like to send that link to someone else who might be interested. So let's move ahead to look at our study area. Our efforts focused on potential improvements for the two 5-point intersections, and these are indicated by the blue dots on the screen. So the first intersection is the Lyndale Avenue, Montana Avenue, Helena Avenue intersection, and then secondly, the intersection at Last Chance Gulch, Helena Avenue, and Neill Avenue downtown. We also evaluated the 4 corridor segments that connect those 5-point intersections between downtown and midtown. And so those included Last Chance Gulch, Lyndale Avenue, Helena Avenue, and Montana Avenue. Over the past several months, we've completed a thorough evaluation of existing and projected conditions within our study area. And we looked at things like traffic characteristics, growth and future projections, safety, roadway geometrics. We made a number of field observations. We looked at past plans, and we also solicited input from the public and stakeholders. And we used all of this information to help understand the issues and concerns and what challenges and limitations might be faced when improvements are made. This evaluation process served as the foundation for our identification of improvements. So I'm not going to focus on the findings from the existing and projected conditions analysis since we developed that information quite a bit earlier in the study process. However, if you are interested in learning more, I encourage you to visit the project website that's hosted on the City Public Works webpage where we've posted more detailed information. And if you open up your chat box, we have a link to that website that you can click on. So next, I mentioned that we conducted public and stakeholder outreach activities earlier in the process to understand the issues and concerns from your perspective. Starting back in June 2018 through the end of last year, we offered a variety of public and stakeholder activities just to request input on things like the focus for the study. We wanted to provide an overview of our study process and share existing conditions findings. And then we also discussed some of our initial areas of focus. And these conversations helped us understand the issues and the needs, and we received valuable feedback on improvement areas. So from those public and stakeholder outreach activities, we heard a number of common themes that were repeated by quite a few individuals. And most of the comments that we heard related to things like ensuring safety for all users, improving pedestrian and bicycle connectivity and accessibility, improving vehicular mobility and connectivity. We also heard a lot about extending Centennial Trail to the east across Montana Avenue, and the importance of preserving the function and access and parking for businesses and private property. And then lastly, we also heard about the need to improve wayfinding and aesthetics through things like signage and general beautification. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Scott Randall, who will discuss the recommendations included in the study.
Great, thank you, Sarah. So I'm going to move into a discussion of the study recommendations, kind of the meat of the report here. So based on our findings and the feedback we have received throughout this process, we identified about 16 locations where we have some sort of a recommendation within the study. The recommendations range from pedestrian, bicycle, and general non-motorized improvements to intersection improvements, street enhancements, and more major reconstruction recommendations. So in some spots, there was a clear-cut solution to address the identified needs, and other locations we identified several potential options and conducted a bit of a screening process to identify what we felt was the best solution. So I want to stress that these recommendations that I'm going to present here are just high-level planning concepts at this point. Before they could move forward into actual implementation and on-the-ground construction, there would be, of course, additional project development that would be required, such as detailed engineering design activities. The final configurations for any of these projects or recommendations may change somewhat from what we're going to show today. So I also want to note that there is no funding identified to this point for any one of these improvements. Specific to the improvements, while we've included some planning level cost estimates for reference, they are in today's dollars, and some of those costs, particularly for the large scale improvements that take a long time to develop, are likely to increase with inflation going forward. So beginning with the Last Chance Gulch corridor, our first recommendation focuses on the segment between Neill Avenue and 6th Avenue, so the one-way segment. For this study, we were tasked with evaluating that portion of Last Chance Gulch to see if it should be converted to two-way traffic or if the current configuration should remain in place. So two-way conversion has been contemplated for a number of years in the community. And with this study, we were asked to figure out what the best solution would be to optimize business access and maintain traffic circulation and understand the impacts of what any changes would have on the surrounding corridor. So we looked at a variety of configurations in detail. What we found is that most options would perform fairly well from a traffic standpoint if we're just looking at vehicles. However, the existing configuration as it is today provides valuable access for businesses, for parking, for loading and unloading and delivery needs. And also when we think about non-motorized accommodations, we felt that bicycle routing through the downtown area could be better accommodated on parallel routes such as Cruise and Fuller Avenues instead of focusing them on Last Chance Gulch. So our outreach with the public and with stakeholders also didn't really identify strong support for converting the current configuration from to two-way traffic flow, nor was there support for removing a travel lane or adding additional bike facilities on Last Chance Gulch itself. So for these reasons, the study recommends maintaining the current two-lane one-way configuration and looking for opportunities to enhance what is out there today. So more specifically, we noted some recommendations to extend some streetscaping enhancements on Last Chance Gulch, particularly between Placer and Neill. This would help provide a more of a gateway feeling into the downtown core and create more uniformity along the corridor. This recommendation could be more of a short to midterm project with a relatively modest cost as opposed to full reconstruction. So moving on, we also looked at the potential for improvements on Last Chance Gulch to the north of Neill, between Neill and Lyndale Avenue. Although we don't believe modifications to the roadway configuration itself are needed, we are recommending that streetscaping improvements be made to enhance the roadway corridor and better match the character and context of the area. The existing facility is pretty wide and feels fairly disconnected from the rest of the downtown and rest of Last Chance Gulch. So there is opportunity to enhance the roadway to improve the look and the feel of the corridor. Improvements could include better signage, lighting, street trees, landscaping. You know, in this area, there's on-street parking up and down the corridor, but it's fairly limited in its use and need in certain areas. So some areas are heavily used for on-street parking and some are not. So I think there's some opportunity to maybe reimagine some of those spaces into more green space, to provide for a traffic calming effect and to provide buffered protection between vehicular lanes and the pedestrian facilities. So this is a recommendation that wouldn't be done overnight, likely wouldn't be done as, redoing the entire corridor at once, but could be achieved as, smaller standalone pieces or as redevelopments of the area occurs. The next recommendations along Last Chance Gulch corridor focus specifically on pedestrians. We observed and heard a lot from folks about the condition of some of the sidewalks. Some of the concrete is cracked or chipped. There's some accessibility barriers. And so in general, we're recommending that, general sidewalk improvements to address these hazards are made. We feel that these improvements would be very beneficial, given the pedestrian focus in the downtown core. We also looked at the major intersections, in particular the two signalized intersections with 6th Avenue and with Lawrence Street. What we're recommending at those intersections is what's called a leading pedestrian interval, which is a change in the signal timing, which actually gives a bit of a head start or priority to pedestrians crossing versus giving a green light to vehicles and pedestrians at the same time. You would actually give the pedestrians about a 3 to 5 second head start before you give a green light to vehicles. This would reduce the amount of unprotected time pedestrians spend in the intersection and also increases their visibility. And if we move just up the streets to the intersection with Placer Avenue, this is another location where we're recommending some improvements specific to pedestrians. We're recommending that the intersection be upgraded to comply with current ADA standards, which includes curb ramps and bulb outs and some crossing treatments, enhanced crossing treatments there to more match the intersections at 6th and at Lawrence Street. Moving on to one of the main focus areas of the study is the 5-point intersection of Last Chance Gulch, Neill, and Helena. So we spent a lot of time at this location evaluating some of the concerns and challenges specific to the intersection. The existing configuration, as shown here in this slide, currently operates fairly well for vehicles. While there's periods with some congestion, vehicles can typically get through the intersection in one signal cycle, even though the signal timing is pretty inefficient because it has to cycle from leg to leg. And so there can be a fair amount of waiting at a red light for the cycle to change for you. So as traffic volumes do grow, over time, this intersection is projected, of course, to get worse and experience more delay. Additionally, the intersection is not particularly friendly or easy to use for pedestrians or bicyclists, especially with the awkward triangle refuge near the Helena Avenue right turn slip lane. So as a potential short-term solution, we're recommending that you look at maybe removing that right turn slip lane and that triangle refuge at the corner of Cruz and Helena. This would allow for the corner to be reconfigured to improve the crossing for pedestrians. Additionally, there's an opportunity for some beautification on the north leg of Last Chance Gulch as you enter the downtown core. Well, this option wouldn't improve traffic conditions or really change specific conditions for vehicles. It does offer small scale improvements to better enhance the intersection and make it more walkable. We also evaluated a lot of long-term options to address long-term identified concerns. So we looked at a number of options from modifying the traffic signal as it is there today to closing the 11th Avenue spur into a roundabout. And the results of the evaluation process resulted in a roundabout being identified as the preferred configuration for a number of reasons. Over the long term, this option is projected to optimize vehicular operations, non-motorized access, and would offer the opportunity for beautification and to have the intersection serve more as a gateway feature into the downtown. Also, with a roundabout, the 11th Avenue spur could be closed, which could provide for an opportunity to enhance the Cruz Park. This slide shows a rendering of what that could look like at this intersection. Configuration would operate, very well now and into the future, given our existing projected traffic volumes. It would also minimize impacts to adjacent properties. So I think that this configuration would still maintain most business access points while improving the intersection from an operational and non-motorized standpoint. Moving on to the Lyndale Avenue corridor, we focused less specifically on this roadway as it is part of US Highway 12 and in the jurisdiction of the Department of Transportation and not the city. So however, we did hear quite a bit about some of the difficulties, particularly with crossing this roadway as a pedestrian. There is currently a marked crosswalk at the intersection with Warren Avenue. Although it has been noted, it's very difficult to see. It's very basic with just some pavement markings and some signing. Does not provide enough protection for crossing pedestrians. So with that in mind, we took a broader look at the corridor to identify the best spot for a pedestrian crossing. So in the end, we're actually recommending that the current crossing location at Warren be removed and an enhanced crossing be made and developed at the intersection just down the road at Ewing Street and Rodney Street instead. So this spot provides an opportunity to better connect with Centennial Trail, the baseball field, and Helena Middle School, and is actually the center point between the intersection with Last Chance Gulch and the intersection at the 5-point intersection to the east. So the bottom images shown here examples of what an enhanced crossing could look like. We don't know exactly, depending on certain considerations, what that would look like. But here's a couple ideas of what an enhanced crossing could be versus the crossing as it is today, which just has some signage and pavement markings. So additional investigation would be needed moving forward to determine exactly what that looks like. But here's a couple ideas. So next up is Helena Avenue. The next two recommendations are for improvements to the bike and pedestrian facilities on Helena Avenue. So currently the bike lanes end quite a ways before the 5-point intersections on each end without much of a transition or warning to bicyclists. So this recommendation would just extend the bike lanes closer to the intersections and provide some transition signage to guide bikes to take the travel lane to maneuver through the intersections. And from a pedestrian standpoint, there's several locations where sidewalks are missing or are damaged or where accessible features are not provided. In several cases, parking lots are paved right up to the curb line, which provide no separation between vehicles and pedestrians. This study, we've identified quite a few spot locations for sidewalk and curb ramp improvements. This may be accomplished in the short to midterm and would greatly enhance access and connectivity on this corridor for pedestrians. Another challenge on Helen Avenue is related to the angle of the road. Helen Avenue creates a series of awkward triangles at the 13th, 14th, and 15th Street intersections, as shown here at the top illustration. So right now, these triangles are striped with yellow paint and create extremely long crossing distances, unprotected crossing distances for pedestrians, and lack definition for drivers entering or exiting from Helen Avenue. So to improve these three spots, the study recommends extending the curb line, adding marked crosswalks and bulb outs as appropriate to improve pedestrian visibility and comforts, and to convert the formal triangle areas to parking or green space to benefit adjacent businesses and residents. This slide shows a couple of examples of what these could look like. The top one shows the extra space of the triangle intersection reimagined into additional building frontage, while the bottom one shows what it could be if it was more envisioned as a public space. Next couple of options are also aimed at some of the skewed intersections along Helen Avenue. At the intersection with 16th Street and Ewing Streets, for example, there are long crossing distances here as well. The intersection operates almost like a 6-point intersection given how closely spaced all of these intersections are. So to address some of these poor geometrics and some of the needs for pedestrians, the study recommends providing a marked crosswalk with curbed bulb outs and ADA ramps to improve the pedestrian crossing visibility and comfort. Additionally, we suggest modifying the northern leg of Ewing Street to intersect Helen Avenue at a more of a right angle to improve visibility and give better definition and distance between the intersection with 16th Street. Moving further northeast, the National Avenue and Boulder Avenue intersection also has some of the same problems and challenges in terms of its awkward intersection angles and poor visibility and long crossing distances for pedestrians. So what we're recommending here is to, again, install a marked crosswalk across Helen Avenue with curb bulb outs to make it safer and more comfortable for pedestrians to cross. We'd also suggest squaring up Boulder Avenue to improve visibility and give some distance and more definition between the intersection with National Avenue just down the road. Moving to our last corridor, Montana Avenue, we've all heard for a long time about the need for a grade separated railroad crossing on Montana Avenue. The existing at-grade crossing, really disrupts vehicular travel on Montana Avenue several times a day. It can create very long queues spilling back to the 5-point intersection. The crossing is a high priority, certainly for the city of Helena and for MDT to reduce congestion and improve safety. Several previous studies have been developed and identified the need for improvements at this location. The most recent being the 2016 Montana Rail Grade Separation Study that was developed by MDT. Our study supports the findings of this document and recommends construction of a grade separated crossing at this location. Of course, as with any large project, the biggest obstacle to making this happen is, of course, funding. So this would be a very expensive improvement, and while traditional funding from MDT likely won't be available for a number of years, given other needs across the state, there are some opportunities to explore some other funding mechanisms, such as grant opportunities and other ways to pursue development of this in the meantime. That leads us to the last major intersection evaluated in the study, the 5-point intersection with Lyndale Avenue, Helen Avenue, and Montana Avenue. Again, although this intersection generally operates fairly well if you're just looking at it from a vehicular standpoint, The signal phase does create some inefficiencies. There's a lot of waiting for the lights to change, and the intersection is quite a barrier for non-motorized uses. We heard from quite a few folks that the intersection is also a barrier in general for the 6th Ward area, since turns from Lyndale Avenue coming from the west are not allowed to make a left turn either onto Helena or onto Montana Avenues. We studied a range of options, again at this location, including maintaining the existing layout, reconfiguring the traffic signal with additional turn lanes, creating a 4-legged intersection by closing Helena Avenue, and installation of a roundabout. After thoroughly evaluating the pros and cons of all these options, the roundabout configuration again was shown as the best to balance the operational and access needs of the intersection. So roundabout would also offer opportunity for beautification of the intersection and adjacent areas. And while this option would definitely be costly and more of a long-term visionary improvement, it would accommodate existing and projected traffic demands, improve pedestrian accommodations, and allow for all turning movements to be made. While the roundabout configuration is larger than the current intersection footprint, there are some open lands and areas that could be used to make the configuration fit. However, it is still likely that there could be some general impacts on the intersection corners and some modifications to business accesses. Our last recommendation focuses on the Centennial Trail. Currently, the trail ends abruptly at National Avenue, and the study was tasked with finding the best route for crossing Montana Avenue and continuing the trail to the east. So we looked at several options for doing this, including routing further to the north and to the south, and ultimately to maintain the look and feel and comforts of a shared use path meant for families and to minimize out of direction travel. The study recommends routing travel along Argyle streets and with a new crossing across Montana Avenue at the Argyle Street, Bozeman Street intersections. So this would allow the best spacing between the 5-point intersections and at-grade railroad crossing. This slide illustrates 2 possible crossing configurations of what that crossing could look like. The top option, this is Argyle Street and the railroad crossing up to the north, up to the top of the screen. So this option would provide a pedestrian overhead beacon that could require vehicles to come to a full stop while pedestrians cross the roadway. This type of crossing could be installed with the current roadway configuration, but there's some concern about vehicle queues and vehicles backing up when they're waiting for pedestrians to cross and the impacts to the railroad tracks to the north. A second option shown here at the bottom is what's called a 2-phase crossing. This would be where pedestrians would cross one direction of travel at a time. The benefit of this is there's less time spent for vehicles having to stop and wait for pedestrians and would result in some shorter queues and vehicles backing up. One of the downfalls, though, would be that this would require some roadway reconstruction to widen Montana Avenue to provide for that pedestrian refuge. And this last slide illustrates how a new crossing would fit into the overall trail corridor. So from this map, you can see where the trail currently ends, right there at National Avenue, with the solid black lines indicating the proposed routing and crossing at Bozeman Streets. The dashed black line shown here also shows a potential connection extending along the Argyle Street alignment to minimize out of direction travel. Although this is currently private land, it would need to be negotiated with the landowner if that were to be able to happen. Routing options east of Robert Street would need to be evaluated based on site constraints and right-of-way. The ultimate goal would be to connect Centennial Trail as it crosses Montana Avenue to the eastern side on the east side of I-15, where it currently terminates at California Street. So again, I want to stress that all of these recommendations and ideas we presented here are just high-level planning concepts at this point. Before they could move forward to implementation, additional project development would be required, including detailed engineering design activities. The final configurations for any projects may change somewhat from what we were showing here in this study. So again, no funding has been identified yet for these improvements either, so more to come to actually turn these into reality. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Sarah to wrap things up, and we can open up the Q&A.
Great. Thanks, Scott, for providing an overview of the recommendations. So I did want to mention that in addition to our public meeting today, we're also conducting targeted outreach to stakeholder groups, and we're holding a public review period for the draft report, which is posted on the city's website. And again, that link to the city website is provided in the chat box. Please note that we are asking for all comments to be submitted by February 19th, and this will just allow us time to review those comments and incorporate any changes before we finalize the study and present to the City Commission. So with that, would like to open it up for questions and comments. And just a few reminders here as we begin the open discussion part of our meeting. Please do type your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You're welcome also to use the thumbs up feature if you want to indicate your interest in someone else's question that was submitted. And again, if you're unable or uncomfortable to ask questions right now, you're welcome to contact Scott directly, and his contact information is up here on the screen. So looks like we'll just wait for a couple minutes here as folks type in your questions to the Q&A box. Okay, it looks like we have our first question here. This is by P. Brewer asking, has there been an in-depth business impact study done on what the potential ramifications of the construction period could be in relation with the proposal of the roundabout at Helena, Neill, Last Chance Gulch? Will businesses that require large truck delivery be able to accept freight without incident? Will there still be limited traffic allowed through the intersection while under construction?
So first, thanks for providing the first question here. I appreciate that. Someone's got to be first, right? Regarding your question, no, at this phase, we haven't looked into traffic control or impacts during construction. As with any project, we always have to consider, local impacts and impacts to businesses. But I know we always try to minimize, those impacts during construction. We know that there's obviously hardships and challenges, with the businesses in the area that are experienced, but we always try to minimize those impacts as much as we can. I can't provide specific details of what that would look like, but we do try to, limit our construction times, provide, best routing, and making sure that the functions of the businesses can still be maintained throughout construction.
Great, thanks for that question. And we'll just keep waiting here as others type in their questions. Okay, we have another question here from Alan Nicholson asking how much of the private land known as the Cared property east of Montana Avenue and north of Boulder would the roundabout require?
Thanks, Alan. And, I guess I'd preface, my response here is saying, we're still pretty high level planning level. We've laid out kind of a concept to see, what that could look like, what that roundabout could look like. And I don't know that I have a firm answer for you. I can certainly talk to you offline and maybe show you kind of our ideas from a plan level to show you kind of some of those impacts area being, of course, if that's your land area. But I don't have a great answer today to, really give you an acreage or anything from that standpoint. But I would say that obviously with the roundabout option, it is quite a bit bigger, of course, in the existing intersection. So knowing that that's currently open lands, and then knowing the other businesses in the area, we have to kind of balance impacts as much as possible and make things work as much as possible. But for the most part, it does work pretty well. But again, I can talk to you offline and maybe show you some of those ideas after this meeting if you'd like.
Great, thanks. Well, it looks like we were receiving quite a number of comments here coming through. So next one from Ryan asking, with respect to the bicycle corridor, what could be a reasonable path forward to making these recommendations happen?
So I guess I'm not clear on the bicycle corridor specifically. I mean, if you're talking about Centennial Trail, if you are talking about Centennial Trail, I think or with any of these recommendations, really, the first step is to know what we're after, what we're trying to achieve, and what what we're looking at from a recommendation standpoint. And so the first step is really to have a plan and to have a study done so that there's support to go after funding and to prioritize those recommendations. So I think as far as making most of this happen, it probably falls at the local level and the commissioners to identify priorities and where the funding should be spent, knowing that there's also some of these recommendations in areas that involve others, such as the BIDs and different districts as far and as also including MDT too. So there's a lot of players. I think it starts with this plan, and then it's up to kind of the local level to prioritize where those needs are and where that funding should be spent.
Thanks, Scott. And Ryan did clarify that, yes, he did mean Centennial Trail and just
Oh, thank
connecting
you.
the bike path and completing the bike path. So I think we addressed that question.
I think, yeah, thank you.
Yes. So next up is John Iverson commenting that love the Montana Avenue roundabout. Who gets to decide the outcome of that project, the city or the state?
So I think that's a great question, and I'd say the priority at that intersection. I mean, it's part of the Highway 12, right? And so the Department of Transportation ultimately has most jurisdiction over that. I would also say that the city has a role in that, of course, being that it's within the city of Helena, and there are the local roads of Helena Avenue that intersect with it too. So I think it is a bit of a partnership. But ultimately, some of that, we got to make sure anything that's done there functions first and foremost for the highway, while balancing all the other needs there as well. So the state would have a very major role in that. A lot of it also depends on funding and how that becomes available too. So whether that's with federal funding or whether that gets pushed from a local level or through grant funding would also influence a little bit about that decision too.
Great. So next up, we have a question from Rex Seeley. So referencing the Last Chance Gulch from Neill to Lyndale, saying that parking is desperately needed and will increase. The landscaping would be great, but we can't lose parking.
Yeah, thanks, Rex. And that's a good comment and something we've certainly talked about a lot with the downtown about just prioritizing parking. There's a couple small segments in there where it's a little less utilized, I believe. But that would have to be a balance that would be worked through with the downtown to determine if it's better to have all that as open parking or if maybe there's a couple spots that could be looked at for removal for some beautification. And I think it's a balancing act. You gotta make sure it works for the businesses and still achieves that need of the downtown too. So I think these are ideas and put out there for discussion purposes and not formalized as we're saying that you should remove parking here and you should do absolutely this. It's more to kind of start that conversation to see what's the priority.
Great. Next, we have a question from Dave asking if there's potential for state funding or MDT funds available for improvements to routes that are considered a state route.
Well, so as far as state funding, that just depends. It's got to play into the Department of Transportation's bigger picture throughout the entire state. Montana Avenue and Lyndale again are part of Highway 12 and are part of what's called the National Highway System. And so there's a pot of federal money that goes to those type of facilities. And what I can tell you is MDT is always committed out at least 5 years and generally longer than that too. And so it's got to fit within their program and their plan. And so we have included them as a stakeholder, and we've had a lot of discussions with them, and they understand some of these needs and challenges. I think the biggest one, of course, that's probably on most people's minds is the railroad crossing, on Montana Avenue. And I think that's definitely a high priority for the states. The challenge, of course, becomes funding and, all the other, design challenges that go into that too. So I certainly can't commit their funding. I know those big projects and those big picture items take a really long time to develop, but you got to start somewhere. And I think having a plan in place helps provide some support for those options.
Okay, so next up, Alan has a follow-up question asking, how would I reasonably develop the cared property in the near future if the future roundabout is to be an option?
Well, Alan, I'm not sure I have a great idea for that. I think working with the city and understanding maybe what your development would look like and what the ideas would be for that development and how any changes to the intersection might impact those areas. I think it's a full understanding of those trade-offs. So I think it'd be just good to sit down and talk about those ideas and what those potential impacts could be, and see how that fits in with the plans for both the intersection and what you're thinking there. I think the biggest key or takeaway would be just to try to minimize developments that are up front and right adjacent to the road facility to keep some area to work with if needed in the future would be probably best practice there. But I think more direct conversations would just be needed there, Helen.
Okay, so following up on Alan's question, P. Brewer has a comment or question asking if there would be any need for the city to acquire any private property through eminent domain methods, and then just clarifying that that's in reference to the roundabout project on Helena Avenue.
Yeah, I think, in general, we don't go through eminent domain. I mean, that's very much a last resort. And I could think of all the projects I've worked on throughout my career, and that's pretty much never happens. I think we try to, if there are ever right-of-way needs or, requirements for projects, we certainly try to work with landowners and do the best we can to make solutions that work for everybody. Eminent domain is not a process it's not a first process that we choose, and certainly something everybody tries to avoid, because it's not, it's not in anybody's interest to force something on anybody.
Okay, and next up we have a question and comment from Richard. So a roundabout at Neill and Last Chance Gulch seems appropriate. However, a roundabout at Malfunction Junction seems unwise because of the density of the traffic and the wide variety of vehicles using that roundabout. So examples including logging trucks and semis.
Yeah, so I'd say that our analysis when we looked at options, we did do a lot of look at the traffic volumes and usages at all these locations. And what I can tell you is that a roundabout would function well. It would handle both the volumes that we see today and the projected volumes that we're looking at into the future. We do have a lot of roundabouts on state highways with a lot of large trucks across the states, and so one reason, as I mentioned, that intersection would look quite a bit larger than it is today is because we need to size that appropriately for those large trucks. Not just your standard logging trucks and normal semis, but also your larger loads too. And so that's why we have design features such as mountable aprons and other areas to make sure that trucks can make those turning movements. So we do totally understand, the needs of large trucks and making sure that it's sized to accommodate to fit those. Also mentioned that the roundabout configuration that we're proposing at the main 5-point intersection is quite a bit looks quite a bit different than the one in the downtown as far as number of lanes and configurations because of the differences in traffic volumes too.
Thanks, Scott. I did want to acknowledge too that P. Brewer had a follow-up comment to this. So there are nearly as many of those large vehicles that come through the Helena Avenue, Neill, Last Chance Gulch intersection as well, and hence why a roundabout there also seems like an unwise idea. But I think you addressed some of that with your comments about the large vehicles.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of a difference. I mean, we do see the larger semis, our design vehicles. What we look at for accommodations are greater on a national highway than they would be in a downtown environment. So those sizes and accommodations do look a little different, but we do certainly understand, the uses and the types of vehicles in the downtown too. And anything we would design would be, we'd make sure to be able to accommodate those type of vehicles.
Great, thanks, Scott. So right now we don't have any other open questions waiting in the Q&A box, but we'll wait just a couple more minutes here to see if anyone else has any questions they'd like to offer. Okay, here comes another question from Richard. Are roundabouts safer for bicycle traffic than the current configuration?
I think there's a couple considerations for bicycles and roundabouts that you need to think about, and obviously, context matters. Whether we're talking which 5-point intersection we're talking about too. What I can say is that both intersections as they are today are not great situations for bicyclists, especially the one on Highway 12, I would say. As a bicyclist at roundabouts, there's a couple different ways you can get through the intersection. One is you can either dismount your bike and go through it as a pedestrian along the sidewalks and walk through it like you would a pedestrian. The other way would be to take up the travel lane like a vehicle would and ride through it as a vehicle would. We do not provide dedicated bike facilities within the roundabout for a number of reasons, because it actually creates more conflicts. The thing I can say is that, overall, when we look at national safety statistics for non-motorized users at roundabouts versus signalized or uncontrolled intersections, we do see a massive improvement in safety at roundabout configurations, particularly when we're talking about severe crashes, fatalities, and serious injuries. And a lot of that is because we're slowing vehicles down, travel speeds are a lot lower. And so when we do have any conflicts, they're at a much slower speed and in a safer environment.
And we have a follow-up question or comment from Chris Smith asking, in addition to being more efficient and safer for bicycles, aren't roundabouts significantly safer for vehicles as well?
Yeah, they are, absolutely. I mean, all statistics, show that roundabouts are safer, especially again from the severe crash standpoints, for all modes of travel.
Okay, we have a question from John asking, did any of your studies show large trucks from Highway 12 West using Last Chance and Cedar to connect to I-15 rather than through Malfunction Junction south on Montana Avenue?
I guess I'd say we didn't do a specific routing or origin destination study to understand exactly the routes that trucks are taking. We do certainly understand what's going through the intersections today, but as far as where they're starting and where they're going, I mean, I can tell you there are a lot of trucks that do take that route to avoid the intersection and then avoid, kind of weaving your way through town on Highway 12. So I would say that that's a very commonly used route for sure.
Okay, and then another one from John here. Are squared up intersections considered quite a bit safer than the angles on Helena Avenue?
Yeah, I mean, I think typically, certainly if we can design anything the way we want, we'd like to have an intersection aligned at a perfect right angle, 90 degrees. And so anytime we start to skew, more and more, you start to make it more difficult for your sight lines, as you're looking, think about going up to an intersection at a skewed angle. You got to look back over your shoulder and it's difficult to see behind you. And so anytime we can improve those angles and make them more squared up is going to have a benefit. Specific to Helena Avenue, we did a pretty thorough safety analysis and looked at a bunch of crash data up and down all these corridors, and we didn't see a lot of concerning trends along Helena Avenue. But anecdotally, we've heard a lot of concerns about just visibility and certainly comfort and feeling of safety for pedestrians too. So trying to balance all of those things.
Great, thanks, Scott. We have a follow-up question too from Gina, who's asking, what measures are in place to ensure accessibility is a priority? We've recently had a wheelchair user hit by a motor vehicle.
I'm not sure that I have a great definitive answer for that. What I can say is that, our direction with this study and I think anytime we, develop actual projects too, I mean, we're trying to think about all modes and all users. Certainly with anytime federal money is being spent or we're doing major improvements, we're looking at improving, accommodations for regarding ADA accommodations and making sure we're meeting current standards. And so I think a lot of the focus we did on this study was focused on accessibility for all users, bicyclists, pedestrians, and vehicles too. This is not a focused study just on making cars go faster and have less delay, but it was trying to focus on making sure all of these corridors and intersections are able to be used by everybody.
And Scott, maybe also in follow-up to Gina asking about accessibility, we did identify several specific locations where we're proposing ADA accessible features to be installed and added that don't exist today. So several intersections, both on Helena Avenue and in the downtown core, where we're proposing new curb ramps and other accessibility features that I think would address your question, Gina. Okay, so no other open questions. Again, we'll just wait a few more minutes to see if anyone else has any thoughts or comments for us. Okay, a question from Chris asking, could there be a pedestrian controlled light on the Lyndale crossing?
Yeah, and so, we talked about providing, an enhanced crossing, and that could mean a number of things. I think, like I mentioned with that recommendation, we understand the existing crossing that's out there now is not serving, not serving the needs of the pedestrians and is kind of difficult to see and doesn't provide a level of protection that's been identified as a need out there. So I think an enhanced pedestrian crossing could look like a number of things, anything from an overhead flashing beacon to the flashing lights. There's a number of different treatments, but I think our idea would be some sort of a pedestrian push button activation where they could go up to it, push a button, and it would provide more visual cues to require vehicles to stop for pedestrians versus as it is today, with just signage and striping that hoping vehicles would stop.
Great. And we have a follow-up question from Alan asking, how do I talk to Scott after this meeting? And Alan, up on our screen, we are sharing Scott's contact information. So you're welcome to give him a call at 447-5005, or you're welcome to send an email to srandall, RANDALL at rpa-hln.com. And Scott would be happy to talk with you further about your questions.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Alan. I'd love to follow up with you.
So next up from Richard, saying that it seemed to me that the proposed roundabout at Malfunction Junction forces traffic that want to go beyond the first available exit to have to change to the inside lane and then back to an outside lane to exit. How is that safer?
So really the function of this roundabout or the layout of this roundabout is fairly similar to what's out there today. Probably the biggest difference would be on the south leg as you're going north coming on Montana Avenue. So if you can see my illustration on the screen here, right now, basically we kind of have that weird, actually, let me see if I can pull this up. Hopefully you can see my screen here, okay? So as it is today, we have the two northbound lanes on Montana Avenue, and you can stay in both of those lanes to go and maintain on the highway. But the right-hand lane also goes and splits onto Montana Avenue to continue straight. So with the roundabout configuration, and again, this is still high-level concept at this point, but with that configuration, the idea would be that the left-hand lane would maintain traffic on the highway, and then the right-hand lane would maintain traffic on Montana Avenue. So if you're wanting to go left, you would be in the left lane like you typically would at most intersections, where you can circle through there. But if you're in the right-hand lane, you would not be able to cross over and turn left, at least how this is laid out. There are some variations where we could allow both of those lanes to turn left by making some modifications on this northern end that could be vetted out through project development. But as we have this shown today, it would basically be left-hand lane would be highway traffic, right-hand lane would be traffic on Montana Avenue. And then regarding the other lanes, as far as how those would work, they basically function exactly as they do today, with the difference being just you're going around a little bit of a circle versus straight. The other difference would be that coming on from Lyndale Avenue, going east into the intersection, instead of only being allowed to take a right turn, if you're in that left-hand lane, you would then be able to continue on to Helena Avenue or to take a left onto Montana Avenue.
Okay, great. So no more open questions just yet, but we'll wait a few more minutes. Okay, well, we don't want to cut anyone off, so we'll just ask for kind of last call for questions here. If there's anything else that you'd like to comment or offer your thoughts. Okay, well, seeing no further questions, we just want to thank everyone for attending today's virtual meeting, and wanted to remind everyone to please take a look at our study website. Again, that's on the City of Helena's Public Works page, and that link is in the chat box. Oh, I'm sorry, it looks like we've got a couple more comments here coming through. So Chris is just commenting, great professional presentation, and thanks that he'd like to see this moving forward. Chris, thanks for that feedback, appreciate it. Richard did have one more question. If you are heading north on Montana Avenue, can you exit the roundabout to Helena Avenue?
So I'm assuming you're probably talking about, well, from a right-hand turn standpoint, yes, you can. If you're going north and want to take a right, you can definitely do that. As far as this leg goes, there are some, taking a left basically onto Helena Avenue, there are some concerns about crossing movements to make that happen. I think there's some tweaks that could be made to this roundabout to make that function, but that is an extremely low volume or low priority movement, knowing that you can take a left on Boulder and everybody uses that connection. So I don't know that I can say definitively yes or no on that. That would have to be vetted out through the design process, but that might be one of those movements that we could restrict just to make it function better for everybody else, knowing that it's such a low volume movement and a low priority.
Okay, thanks, Scott. So with that, I did just want to, again, point you all to the website and where you'll find links to the draft report. We also have some info sheets that are summarizing some of our previous work and also the information that we've shared today. And of course, we will be posting a video recording of our presentation. And then lastly, just a reminder that all of the formal written comments on the draft report, we're asking for those to be submitted by February 19th. And best to either email those into to Scott. That's probably the best way to submit your comments on the report. So thanks again, everyone, and we really appreciate your participation and interest in the study.
Thank you, everyone, for participating today.